Hey, what's up guys? Lewis here with Shutterstock Tutorials, and today we're going to be having a look at slow motion and when to use it, or perhaps better said, when not to use it. So recently I was out testing my new camera and it can shoot 120 frames per second, and while I was setting up, a surfer ran in front of me on his way to the shore, and I thought, you know what, it's going to be a great time to get some B-roll I wouldn't normally be able to get, or some stock footage. So I cranked the camera way up to 120 frames per second, and this was the result. Way too slow. And here's the thing. I've wanted 120 frames per second 4K for quite some time now, but actually when it comes to filming people, it's not entirely useful. Now, I've had cameras that could shoot way slower. However, say around about 2016, if you had a 4K camera, it was only likely that you're going to be shooting at 1080 for 60 frames per second. Moving forward, 4K 60 frames per second became a norm. However, if you wanted to shoot 120 frames per second, it would be at 1080. Now, 2021, we're starting to see a lot more cameras being able to shoot at 4K and 120 frames per second. But is there really a need in doing so? Well, today, let's have a look at each higher frame rate bracket and when's best to use them. We are going to be basing this video on the standard 24-25 frames per second. So sometimes, like the newly released 6K Pro, you may only have a camera that can shoot double the standard frame rate for the camera, which may be 48 to 50 FPS at 4K, or 6K in the 6K Pro's case. And initially, this may seem like a detriment whenever cameras are leaning into that 60 FPS region. But in fact, the double frame rate is perfectly adequate for several elements to be captured in slow motion. For example, if we look at the speed of the waves and the girl reacting, it's not outside the boundaries of feeling normal. The waves still have power, but there's that feeling it's slightly slower than real life. Because it doubles a single second, it's not slow enough to become fully evident that slow motion is taking place. But contradictory to that, it is slow enough to emphasize a given moment. Now, I find 48 frames per second is often best to show an instance in time. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, it's not something that's going to be prolonged slow motion where it's visibly noticeable that you're showing slow motion, but something like a stranger's touch where the character slightly notices it, or perhaps a valuable item rolling off the edge or something, but you still need the speed of the item to show the immediate danger, but that slow motion prolongs that moment a little bit more. 60 frames per second, at least for online content creation, has become the staple entry for slow motion. Given it's only 10 to 12 frames faster than 4850, meaning it's 2.5 times faster than 24, reverting into 2.5 times slower when stretched down, is there really a significant difference? Well, let's take a look. Here, an actor is walking in 24 frames per second. It's a standard, if not slightly fast walk, but it takes him a solid 10 seconds from the start to the end point. Suppose we compare 48 frames per second to 60 frames per second, 48 on the left and 60 on the right. We can see it takes 3 to 4 seconds longer for him to reach the end point. In filmmaking, that's a decent amount of time. Also, on the 60 frames per second shot, we can see it's actually allowed him to grow a little taller too. So 60 frames per second is great for dramatic character moments. It's slow enough to be noticeable and put emphasis on the given moment, whether that's the hero shot, closing in on an emotional moment, or slowing down time in an important scene. Essentially where there's a human character involved. But then on a technical level, at 2.5 times the speed slower, it's also going to be great to negate the handheld movement that you're going to get when you're walking around with your mirrorless camera. Obviously not to the point where if you're running with it, but steady and slow steps at 60 frames per second is going to make that motion a lot more fluid. Now, 120 frames per second, which is what we're seeing more mid-budget cameras add with their 4K resolution, is 5 times slower than the standard 24 frames per second. Realistically, there's not an inherent need to use this when filming everyday motion. For example, if we go back to the actor, it takes nearly 3 seconds for a single step. So when would you want to use 120 if your camera houses it? Well, typically anytime something is happening than what we can humanly see. For example, here I have these house sparrows playing around in the snow. These tiny birds can fly up to 46 kilometers an hour, making them very fast. However, at 120 frames per second, their flight slows down, allowing the audience to see their wing movement adequately and properly see them move and land around the garden. Typically, any subject that becomes obscured with motion blur, like animals, water, or fast action sports, can benefit from 120 frames per second. Now, this is not to say don't save for a camera with 4K 120 FPS, it's an excellent addition, but on a practical level, it's not likely that you would be using this frame rate often. So if you did have to choose between a camera that has 120 FPS 4K or a camera that has built-in NDs, for example, I would say go for the NDs. Now, what I think contributes to this is the spotlight that we have on slow motion material. Say when we see videos of balloons popping at 1,000 frames per second, because obviously 1,000 frames is an incredibly higher amount than 120 frames per second, and it creates that false sense of how slow 120 frames is. But you have to remember that 120 frames per second is 5 times slower than 24. So that single second of footage has just become 5 seconds, and for filmmaking, for editing, that can become a long time. Now, as we see 120 FPS introduced at 4K resolution, we're also seeing even faster frame rates like 180 introduced at 2K or 1080. Now, the same principles apply as 120, as we've moved out of the region of reasonable purpose to film humans at this speed. So it will be useful for elements that have a lot of fast moving subjects that they need to be slowed down even further. And then when we push past 180, we're really moving into special use frame rates typically used for advertising, wildlife and sports. So let's break that down. Double the frame rate, 4850, is great for emphasizing small moments to mean something bigger. 60 frames per second is great for character scene importance and bringing the audience into the bubble of that character's emotion. 120 frames per second is great for fast moving subjects, elements and sports. 180 frames per second, again great for fast moving subjects, elements and sports, but with a greater emphasis on slowing things down. Now, one final thing to consider, I'm going to have to be quick. I don't know if you guys have noticed throughout this tutorial, I've been gradually moving the camera back because the sun is slowly creeping around this wall and it's going to overexpose my face at any given moment. But one final thing to consider, which isn't as obvious, is the storage for both your camera and at home for your hard drives, because shooting in slow motion takes up a lot of space. 30 seconds, 120 frames per second, suddenly becomes 2.5 minutes. If you're shooting with a high data rate camera, that's gigabytes upon gigabytes, and it's going to be quite costly. So, I've been Lewis with Shutterstock Tutorials. I hope you've enjoyed this one, and I will catch you guys next time.